To be sitting in your own home and someone come in and murder your mother in front of you and then start on you, it's pretty horrendous.
What else could they have done that would result in such a terrible crime?
The brutality of the killing was incredible.
The Fens, you either love it or you hate it. A lot of people can't stand it because it is featureless. There aren't many trees, but it's got a beauty all of its own. The bleakness attracts people.
It's lonely, it's wild, it's desolate. You either love it or you hate it.
The Fens at various times of the year, I think, can be described as eerie. In the wintertime in particular, it's bleak. It's a place where you can almost, as you drive round, feel there's an ability to get lost.
The people who live in the Fens are vigilant. They do take notice of what's going on around them. And of course, a lot of the people who are in those areas, their day has a pattern to it. So things out of the ordinary do tend to stand out.
Janice Sheridan lived in this remote house in East Anglia with her mother Connie and their 27 dogs. It offered them quiet isolation and the perfect environment for breeding their beloved whippets.
Mum really felt she would have liked a fresh start, and it was really quite obvious that Jan would follow because they were together, and it was an ideal situation where the house they'd bought was just absolutely idyllic and perfect for what Janice wanted to do, was breed the dogs.
So they were very much a couple. They hoped for a peaceful life where they could do just what they wanted to do and not annoy anybody else.
Jan seemed to be sort of isolated as her and her mother tended to cut themselves off from people and just surround themselves with their beloved whippets.
There were very few houses, it was a one-way dirt track really, and she wanted seclusion. She'd walk her dogs up the riverbank, which is just literally out of the back door. She'd let her dogs loose on the field up there. I always got the feeling she thought it was heaven and that she'd arrived where she wanted to stay, and she loved it.
They really didn't need any more company from outside because they really did have all they needed, and that was enough for them.
Dogs were a big part of Janice and Connie's life. In 1994, Janice took a part-time job, helping out at the local greyhound kennels of John Bromley and his partner, Sylvia.
She was the old school, the very old school. She'd worked with horses, she'd worked with dogs and kennels before. She knew about routine and timekeeping. She didn't come to work at 5 to 8 or 5 past. She came at 8 o'clock.
Come on, home now. We'd have a little chat, put the world to rights. She'd ask me what needed doing. Generally it was the same every day because of the routine in kennels. And she'd get on with it and we'd just have a bit of a laugh and a joke as we went.
She used to help me with the kennel work and the exercising of the greyhounds. She was a wonderful, wonderful lady. Never heard her say bad about anybody. She just got on with her life.
On the morning of Sunday, January the 10th, 1999, Janice Sheridan failed to turn up for work.
Jan didn't appear, which was very, very strange. She was always here. She was always on time. So Sylvia said, well, she said, it's an icy morning, and she only lived a mile away from us. So she said, I'll have a ride up, see if her car's gone in a dike or something.
I went to her house and everything was shut up. The car was there, but I heard all this manic barking, and I thought that was odd, but then I just thought, not really happy, but maybe she seriously has got a really bad cough or cold and she feels just dreadful and just simply can't get out of bed. So I thought, I think I'll just leave it for now, even though I thought at the time, it just doesn't ring true to me. And at the About 3 hours had elapsed, and I went back again because I just had this nagging doubt in my mind. I was frightened the second time I went back because I then, when I realised she wasn't up, started really peering through windows and banging on doors and actually screaming, "Jan, if you're there, answer me, please." And then I think I really did know when I peered through the windows and saw the dog mess and the frenzy that they'd created. There was no way those people in there were actually alive.
Sylvia rushed home to raise the alarm and called the police.
2 policemen came on the scene and told us to wait where we were, and they were gone for what seemed forever to me. It was probably no more than 20 minutes actually, but it seemed to last forever. And when they came back out, I think both officers were clearly white-faced and ashen, and I just said to him, "Is my friend dead in there?" And he said, "Madam, I cannot tell you any more. Someone will come to see you." Well, I knew then.
Police are tonight investigating the deaths of 2 women found stabbed in an isolated Fenland village.
I've investigated a number of murders, certainly murders involving stabbings to the victims, but this one was particularly brutal.
To have been killed in such a brutal fashion, which in 20 years of policing I'd never come across, it certainly was an odd feeling.
I personally in my career never seen a scene like that.
The brutality of the killing was incredible.
The detached house in Upwell, where the blood-stained bodies of the 2 women were discovered yesterday lunchtime. Police are refusing to name them until next of kin have been informed, but it's understood they're Connie Sheridan, who's in her 70s, and her daughter Janice, who's in her 40s.
It was on a Monday night we first heard. And in actual fact, we didn't hear it from anybody. It came up on the news, on the television, and it was just flashed up on there that these 2 people had been found. We then had to just get in touch with the police because they were looking for us.
Today, the police sealed off Pingle Bridge, close to where the women lived. Detectives are working on the theory they were murdered.
It is quite a desolate area. Pingle Bridge itself is not an area that actually leads anywhere. It's a dead-end road, so you wouldn't go down there unless you actually had a reason to go there.
When we arrive there, one of the first thoughts that comes through your mind is, how am I going to find eyewitnesses when the location is so isolated?
At that time of year, which was early in the year, it was cold and it was extremely bleak. And that kind of set the scene, I think, for the whole investigation itself.
Faced with one of the most horrific double murders they'd ever seen, and concerned the killer would strike again, Norfolk police prepared to launch a massive manhunt.
Our grief is indescribable, and we implore...
Devastated, the family appealed for the public's help.
The person or persons responsible must be brought to justice.
It was just like a bad dream, just like a nightmare. You wake up and it's not true. It was just awful, dreadful. We couldn't think, what on earth could they have done to have provoked somebody to do something so dreadful? It just seems senseless. Total waste of 2 lovely lives.
You're grasping at straws, you know, you're trying to think, your head's spinning. Why? That's the big question, the big word that you keep using all the time. Why?
Why choose them? Why go to that house?
Why? What reason? Why?
On Sunday, January the 10th, 1999, a mother and daughter were found viciously murdered in their own home.
It appeared calculated, sadistic, and particularly horrible.
The discovery of 79-year-old Constance Sheridan and 45-year-old Janice sent shockwaves through the close-knit Fenland community.
You don't think that in a sleepy little place like that anything like that is going to happen.
On the Sunday evening, police entered the property for the first time.
When the patrol officers first went to the rear of the property, the first thing they were confronted with was a number of whippets. Some ran outside, some remained in the house. At which point, the door that led into the front room, they couldn't open it. And in fact, what had happened was that the large sofa within that room had been pulled across the doorway to prevent anybody getting in. Once they'd gained access, they looked into the room, and laying on the sofa was Constance. She was clearly dead. And looking across the room in front of the fireplace, they saw Janice, and Janice was lying on her back. She had her feet taped together, and they were actually on an adjacent chair.
There were a vast number of stab wounds to both Constance and Janice.
When we found Constance, who was lying on the settee, it was later established that she had 10 stab wounds, and they were all in her chest and abdomen area. Janice had 11 stab wounds. 10 were in a similar area of her chest, but significantly perhaps one was in the middle of her back. But interestingly, there was very little signs of a struggle at all.
Someone knew what they were doing. This is not some sort of momentary act of madness done on impulse or anything. It was very carefully committed. But there's also a very clear ability to be able to commit the crime in phases, in sections, and not to panic, and to do it quite methodically and purposefully. So all of these things were very striking quite early on.
The way the two women had been murdered was terrifying, but there was another chilling aspect to the killings.
I personally in my career never seen a scene like that, where two bodies appeared to have been left in a particular position by whoever had killed them. Certainly Constance appeared to have been laid on the sofa. Whether that was before or after she died, we may never know. But certainly the position of her body was almost posed to the point where her arms were laid across her chest.
Janice had her legs actually raised from the floor. Around the ankles were bound with a tape. And further examination later actually indicated that it was very likely Janice's wrists had also been bound with a similar tape. And sadly was in a state of almost total undress.
This was very striking, and immediately rang alarm bells that there was a strong sexual element to it.
When I looked at the scene and saw the layout and saw the positionings of the bodies, it was fairly clear to me that this had been a sexual killing.
Another aspect of crime was an interest in bondage, and this was seen in two ways. One, by using duct tape to go around the ankles of the feet, and that was actually left, again showing the desire to see the pose. So increasingly I was thinking this must be some sort of a fantasy enactment. This was not something to be hastily rushed through. This was just something to savour, something really to go through. The fact that the clothes were taken off and put on suggests that we're talking not just a quick 10 minutes here. We're talking about someone who could have been in that room for a couple of hours. And he could have taken films of it to take away as a memento. That increases the likelihood that what we're dealing with here is a masturbatory fantasy, which has been held many, many times before. But this time, on this occasion, it was acted out.
With the true horror of the crime unveiled, police now knew they were looking for a very dangerous man. And in such a small community where word gets around fast, local people became alarmed. Would he kill again? And could he be someone they knew?
Murders do happen every day, but not in little sleepy Fenland villages like this. It's a very closed community, it's very quiet, we all know everybody else. So when something like this actually happens, it's scary because you don't know if it's someone in the village who's just sort of blown a fuse and just randomly killed 2 people, or if it's someone out there with a purpose.
Everybody in the local community was frightened at the time because no one knew who had did it, whether it was a local person, someone that had just come into the area. No one knew who it was.
Where you have someone who's a psychopath, who has no capacity for guilt whatsoever, combined with high intelligence, there's every reason to believe that the person would be looking seemingly normal from the outside. So the first rule was don't say, oh, he's a nice chap, therefore let's exclude him, because quite probably it could be a complete false image that is portrayed to most people.
For 3 weeks, forensic teams combed the crime scene for vital clues. Police were convinced the room where the bodies were found held all the answers.
The crime scene is extremely important to any major investigation, and particularly a murder. And in this particular instance, with the murder taking place inside a house which is controlled from the elements, there was a great opportunity for us. There is so much information contained within that scene that it's absolutely essential that we take the maximum from it.
Everything you do has implications further down the line, and you only have one chance of taking the samples, one shot at it, and you can't go back. The forensic potential with respect to Janice was greater. Her clothing had been displaced, her feet had been bound, and so we had good reason to believe there was a lot of contact by the murderer. Once you see what has happened to the bodies, you start thinking about the sequence of events. If there's stabbing injuries, you'll be thinking about, could the murderer have left his DNA behind? Could he have cut himself while he was stabbing the person? Could he have had contact? Could he have left body fluids, saliva, semen, anywhere on the body? So as a result of that, we took some samples from her breast and we took the tape from her legs. And in this case, we used specialist techniques to bring up fingerprints or footwear marks that you couldn't see with the naked eye.
Very early on in the investigation, in terms of the forensic evidence, what was particularly interesting and exciting was this thumb mark, which was found in the front room on the hearth, very, very close to where Janice's head was. So we were very, very interested in this mark.
I was absolutely convinced that the donor of that thumb mark was the person who'd murdered Janice and Constance. But there was other evidence, forensic evidence, that had been gathered.
The real breakthrough was when we did DNA analysis on the breast swabs from Janice. We found naturally DNA from Janice there, but there was traces of DNA from a man, tiny, tiny traces, which were obviously of key interest. But the downside was that there wasn't enough to identify who that was, and we just had to be patient and had to wait.
There was further frustration for the police, as a thumbprint found on the hearth failed to match any existing criminal records. With seemingly nothing to go on, what was baffling them most was how did the killer get into the home of these 2 intensely private women?
I don't think Mum would have let anybody in that she was suspicious of, because Mum was very astute. Janice was the same. She wouldn't have had time for any silly talk.
I never went into the house. On each occasion, I'd knock on the back fence and a gate. You would hear the back door unlock, and she'd come out and almost guard the entrance to the house.
Fire crews took 6 hours to put out the blaze, and the next day, Rosemary Griffin and her partner...
There was no forced entry to the scene, which means I'm absolutely convinced that the person was invited in.
We knew she wouldn't have had anybody else in there unless she knew them. So it was hard to think that the person they'd actually let inside their home, they knew, but didn't realise what awful thing was going to happen.
Most murders, really, we start looking at associates, friends, associates, and that's because statistically there is some previous contact, some previous knowledge between the murderer and the victim.
Desperate to catch their man, police now decided to focus their efforts on the local Fenland community. They began by paying particular attention to anyone who'd had any contact with Janice and Connie.
We were firmly of the opinion it was somebody who lived locally, or perhaps had lived locally, or somebody who regularly visited the area. And the two particular groups of people we were interested in at that stage were the Whippet fraternity, because of Janice and Constance's interest in Whippet, and the fishing fraternity. We do know that Janice walked her dogs on a very regular basis, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. And of course, she'd walk along Pingle Road, across Pingle Bridge, where invariably she would see the fishermen. So in terms of witnesses, they were a group of people we were particularly interested in.
Police were determined to leave no stone unturned. Suspicion fell on Janice Sheridan's friend and employer, John Bromley.
And it was pretty heavy during the police questioning because they had no clues or anything, and I suppose I was the #1 suspect. But when you're being looked at for a double murder and your whole life is put under a microscope, it's a pretty harrowing thing. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. A lot of people in the community thought it was me. Suspicions, gossip. You'd walk into a local shop or the post office or the garage and everyone would stop speaking. And that was pretty nasty.
So obviously there was an aura of suspicion over us, and I can understand why people felt like that, because we'd been so close to Jan. Yes, and it was quite a frightening time for us.
4 weeks after Janice and Connie were murdered, and after questioning anyone who had come into contact with them, police were no closer to catching the killer. Still convinced he was a local man, concern was growing that he would strike again.
It's fair to say that you do feel a sense of responsibility, and there is that pressure on you, because with the best will in the world, you just can't predict whether this person is going to kill again.
Anyone capable of committing a crime of this outrageous, horrendous nature, so calmly, so coolly, and without any remorse, is entirely capable of doing it again.
Six weeks after the brutal murders of Connie and Janice Sheridan, their killer was still on the loose. Police feared he was already looking for his next victim.
If someone has committed a crime of that monstrous and extreme proportions, they are extremely dangerous. What tends to happen is that they live off the memory of the most recent crime, where it is clearly enacted to gratify fantasy. But sooner or later, the memory will lose its bloom, and it's time to sort of add a new one to the repertoire. Question then is, what's sooner, what's later? Well, given the forensic awareness of this particular individual, it would be when the next opportunity arose where somebody who was in a similar category, vulnerable, likely not to be found quickly, and therefore they could become the next vehicle for his fantasy.
I locked my doors. I made sure that my doors were locked even more securely after that.
I think people did lock their doors, but there was a murderer on the loose. I think people were more diligent about security.
At a news conference, Norfolk Police announced a reward of £25,000 for information which will lead to the killer.
We really did hope, because we were convinced, in particular, that the murderer was known to Janice and Constance, that this would be a good way of teasing out that a little bit of extra information which would lead us directly to that murderer.
we were still looking for a breakthrough. We were still looking for that needle in a haystack.
70 officers were now working on the case, but the investigation was going nowhere. And they still had no clear suspects. Under pressure, the police decided to take more drastic measures.
By the middle of April, we still hadn't identified the thumb mark on the hearth by Janice's head. So we took the step of undertaking a mass fingerprint screen, which included the whole of Upwell village and the surrounding area.
Everyone in the community who was over the age of 12, male or female, was fingerprinted. Our girls were fingerprinted.
The local community were very, very receptive, and everybody cooperated with this fingerprint screen. Nobody objected to their fingerprints being taken.
With the mass fingerprinting well underway, police decided to step up the search and turn their attentions once again to the dog world. Janice and Connie had been regular visitors to Crufts, and still convinced they'd known their attacker, police went to Britain's biggest dog show. Would the killer be there?
The police did sort of stay in the background, but they had a place and store, and it was announced also that the police were there and looking for anybody who might have some information. Would they please come forward?
It was quite a sad occasion because it was an environment that they were used to being in and obviously very happy in, and we could only remember with sadness that they weren't there to enjoy it.
In the year the Sheridans were killed, Janice had high hopes for one of her dogs, Dylan, and as a mark of respect, a friend decided to show him on her behalf.
Dylan, I think, was everything she'd waited to happen. He was everything that she wanted in a dog. And it was a terrible thing that he'd achieved to get to Crufts, and she'd actually managed that. And to think somebody else was there in the ring, parading him round, was very, very hard, because she should have been there.
And it was with some pride that you saw Dylan. But on the other hand, it was a shame. It should have been Jan.
But, frustratingly for the family and police, the visit to Crufts offered no new clues.
It was like one door closing, but the trouble is you didn't know where the next door was to open.
3 months into the inquiry, despite the volume of information that had come into the inquiry, the number of people we'd spoken to, we were no further identifying whoever was responsible for killing Janice and Connie.
But all that was about to change. The killer's luck was running out. The vigilance of the Fenland community would give police their biggest breakthrough.
On the days leading up to the discovery of Janice and Connie's bodies, another local couple saw a large saloon car leaving the area of Zeilmeyer, which was their house, along Pingle Road.
This early sighting was useful, but more significantly, there was a second witness statement from a local farmer who'd noticed a strange car parked near Janice and Connie's house on the weekend of the murders.
In an adjacent farm gateway, he saw the vehicle parked, and he memorised the number, and in fact he recorded it when he got home. This car index number was extremely important because it's the first time in the inquiry we had a piece of information that we could act directly upon, and of course the car was so close to the house.
At the time, the two car sightings led nowhere, when initial number plate checks drew a blank, leading police to conclude that the farmer had memorised part of the plate incorrectly. This left them with the daunting task of checking thousands of plates with a similar number. However, 3 months later, the farmer's information would prove crucial, and for D.I. Chapman was the key to cracking the case.
I'm looking into the rear of this lorry with the spray coming up, and I'm aware of some headlights coming towards me. And as I watched the headlights, literally out the corner of my eye, I caught the number plate of an approaching car. It appeared on that split second to bear some resemblance to the number of the car that had been seen in Pingle Road at the time of Janice and Constance's death. The following morning I went into work and my colleague jotted down one or two variations of the number, and he did some police national computer checks on those numbers, and he wrote down a series of registered owners, one of which was a Kevin Cottrell. We did some checks on our own computer database, and we saw Kevin Cottrell actually appeared in that database on two occasions, and this was a real turning point of the inquiry, because Kevin Cottrell had actually been to Janice and Constance's house before as a double glazing salesman, and his name was also in the system because he owned a vehicle that started with the registration number G567. So this was a turning point and a really exciting time. We instructed an officer straight away to drive to Kevin Cottrell's home address to take a witness statement from him and to routinely take his fingerprints. And by lunchtime the following day, we'd identified Kevin Cottrell's thumbprint with the thumbprint found on the hearth by Janice's head. And we were confident then that we'd identified the killer of Constance and Janice. And we immediately dispatched officers to his house to arrest him.
It was a strange experience when we arrived. I remember looking up the driveway and Kevin was just stood there looking down at us. We got out of the car, we walked down the driveway. I introduced myself to him. I asked him to listen to what one of the officers with me was going to say. He was formally placed under arrest, and there was just absolutely no reaction from him. Over the years I've made many arrests. The more serious the arrest, the more people tend to react to it. When we arrested Cottrell, and he'd just been told that he was under arrest for the murder of 2 women, there was no reaction. There was no reaction at all. He merely asked if he could change his slippers. I remember that after all these years. It was odd then, it's odd now. The gut reaction was that here we had a major suspect, and if he turned out to be the killer, I don't think any of us there would have been surprised.
Kevin Cottrell was brought to King's Lynn police station. 4 days of tough questioning was about to begin.
As we got back, you could almost feel his brain spinning at 100 miles an hour as he was thinking to himself, how have they got to where they are? How have they come here? What did I do wrong? You could almost feel it coming up him. He was very tense. It was a very tense moment.
4 months after the murders of Janice and Constance Sheridan, their family were informed of the arrest of Kevin Cottrell.
You're just so relieved when you get news like that. It is just such a relief. You've been pent up for such a long time.
I thought, great, they've got this bastard that killed Jan and Connie, and he's going to be punished now.
For the first time in the investigation, police had a major suspect in custody, and they began to build a picture of the type of person they were dealing with. Kevin Cottrell was a local man and had grown up in the small village of Pentney, where he still lived with his father. Cottrell did have a previous criminal conviction back in 1983 when he was a teenager. But unfortunately at the time, juveniles' fingerprints were not kept on record.
In the early 80s, he was aware that somebody in the village was away on holiday, the house was unoccupied, and he broke into the house and he masturbated on the bedding and the underwear of the girl who lived there.
For the last 2 years, he'd been working as a door-to-door salesman, latterly for a window company.
In general, the profile fitted Kevin Cottrell really rather well. And it comes as no surprise that Cottrell chose the job he did, which means going from place to place, sharking for potential victims who would fit the criteria to use as vehicles for his fantasies.
To his friends, on the face of it, he was a very smartly dressed, very successful businessman. But the reality was he had no money, he couldn't hold a job down, and I think the bottom line, Kevin Cottrell was one of life's losers.
After the arrest, police and forensics teams moved in on Cottrell's home, eager to see if it held any secrets.
We conducted a search and we found some key evidence. We found a bag which appeared to have blood on it. We found a pair of boots and we found a penknife, and these were all submitted for forensic examination.
As soon as we realised there was blood on the bag, then it was whisked off to the forensic laboratory so that we could analyse the blood on it and find out where the blood had come from.
Would this blood prove to be Janice's or Connie's? The police would have an anxious wait for the vital forensic evidence. Now that he was in custody, police had only 4 days to legally detain Cottrell. Would he crack under the pressure of police questioning?
The advice I gave the police was that the perpetrator in interview would be charming, pseudo-charming, would be initially at any rate helpful, would be someone who was concerned and playing all the right cards.
He was very laid back, he was very helpful. How can I help you, officer? I have to get home to get my dad's tea on. It was all a matter of very laid back.
The nature of the commission of the crime was so well planned, so carefully unfolded, and so calmly enacted that the offender thought that there had been nothing to connect him sufficiently closely to the mother and daughter, and therefore he thought that he'd got away with it.
After 2 days of intensive questioning, Cottrell was still denying ever having been to the house. With no news yet from forensics about the blood, and 2 days left to hold him, police were desperate for a breakthrough. 4 months had passed since the blood-stained bodies of Janice and Connie Sheridan were discovered in their isolated home.
It's just a totally senseless killing of just 2 defenceless women.
70 officers had been working on the case, and police had taken over 2,500 statements. The search for the killer became one of Norfolk's biggest ever manhunts. But finally, police were convinced they'd got their man. Kevin Cottrell lived locally and was working as a door-to-door window salesman. He'd been in custody and under intense police questioning for 2 days and was denying all knowledge of the crime.
As the interviews went on, we had to probe different areas, and one of the areas we had to probe was this a sexual crime? Up until then, Cottrell had been very laid back and friendly, but once we started talking about the sexual nature of this crime, he withdrew and was very uncomfortable.
It's true to say that people who are psychopathic, because they have no sense of guilt or worry about hurting other people's feelings, can be extremely cool, calm and collected. But very often that psychopathy comes with a hell of a lot of baggage in terms of ego. So if you start to probe that ego, unless they're extremely controlled, they will respond by showing agitation, annoyance, contempt.
Police knew he'd been to the house 7 months before and had measured up for a window in the room where Janice and Connie were killed. But Cottrell was still denying ever having been in that room. With only 2 days left to legally hold him, and still awaiting vital forensic evidence, it became critical to place him at the scene.
We discussed how he'd set up his window. He had a dummy window to set up, how he'd set this up in the conservatory area, and he'd given some kind of sales pitch to the 2 women in this conservatory area. He was asked at length as to whether or not he'd been anywhere else in the house other than the conservatory area, and he continually said that he had not.
With time running out, police decided to confront Cottrell with their strongest evidence.
Once he was told that there was fingerprint evidence elsewhere than the conservatory, he changed his story completely, and he told us that he did recall having been elsewhere in the house than the conservatory. At that point, we were very happy that he not only knew he'd been to Pingo Bridge, but he knew exactly what he had done to those 2 women when he went there.
At Lynn Magistrates Court today, Kevin William Cottrell faced 2 murder charges.
On the 27th of April 1999, Kevin Cottrell was charged with the double murder of Janice and Connie Sheridan. Less than 30 minutes later, the DNA evidence came through, and it was damning. Samples taken from Janice's breast swabs matched Cottrell's DNA, and the blood on the bag found at his home belonged to Connie and Janice. Despite all this, Cottrell still insisted he was innocent.
During all the preliminary court hearings, there was never an indication that Cottrell was going to plead guilty. He maintained his innocence right the way through to the trial date.
I could see no defence. The evidence was absolutely overwhelming that Kevin Cottrell had been the person in that house and Kevin Cottrell had murdered Janice and Constance.
When the victim's family arrived at Norwich Crown Court for the trial, nobody knew that Kevin Cottrell would have one more trick up his sleeve.
When we went to the court, I was very fearful that we were going to have a long hearing, which wasn't going to be pleasant for any of us. But at the same time, we might get answers to some of the questions that we wanted answers to.
We turned up at court for the start of a trial on a Monday morning. He had some discussions with his barrister, and very surprisingly, he then pleaded guilty, and he offered no explanation whatsoever.
He stood up, but this time it was guilty. And it was just as he said guilty, it's just as though guilty to a parking fee, not the horrific crime that he'd done.
My clear conclusion is that Cottrell had absolutely no remorse or guilt for what he's done whatsoever. And in pleading guilty, he did so for one reason only: self-interest, because he would get a lighter sentence, or likely to get a lighter sentence, for having come clean. But only because it's in his interest, not out of any sense of decency.
We wanted answers, and we knew then that we weren't going to get any answers. He wasn't going to speak to anybody. And we've been left with something that we don't understand and probably never will understand.
This was something which was a private world for the perpetrator, and something which I would imagine he'll go to his dying day not telling anybody about, because this is for him and him alone.
Kevin Cottrell received 2 life sentences for the double murder. He was sent to prison with a recommendation that he serve at least 20 years.
When you first meet Cottrell, there's nothing untoward about him. You would pass him by on the street and not give him a second glance. It's only once you started looking and probing into his life that it became obvious that there was serious flaws within his whole lifestyle. I think he would pick another victim. He may have already done so. We never did find the weapon that he used. And again, I will stick my neck out and I will say I believe that Kevin Cottrell still has that weapon hidden away somewhere. In my own personal opinion, he is undoubtedly, as far as women are concerned, one of the most dangerous individuals I've ever met.
Sometimes we all have a need to make a dent on the world. This is a pretty big dent. We've done something really, really off the map for most of us to get our heads round. You are someone, albeit in the most negative possible way, the most destructive possible way, but you are someone.
That man has destroyed our family's lives. And I want him to say why he did it and why he did it to our mother and our sister. Why does anybody deserve that?
If anybody deserves an explanation, then the family do. But unfortunately, there was no explanation forthcoming and there hasn't been one since. Personally, I've got 4 years left before I retire. And it would be nice, within that period of time, for Kevin Cottrell to explain what happened, why he went to the house and why he killed Janice and Constance.
Whatever he told you would be a lie. You would never get the truth. Of that, I'm convinced. He's not worth thinking about. He's destroyed our lives in many, many ways.
We weren't allowed in the house until everything had been prepared for us to go in and just to say our last goodbyes, really. You walked through the house and it was eerie, it was quiet. I could see Mum sitting in her chair in the corner where she always sat, and we went outside into the garden. It was a lovely day, bright sunshine, quite a cold day, if I remember rightly. And it was almost as though they were there in the garden. You could sense their presence in the garden.
And I'm all mixed up, feeling cornered and rushed. They say it's my fault, but I wonder so much. Wanna fly her away with the sun and rain coming over my face, wash away all the shame. But just stop and stare, don't worry me, 'cause I'm feeling for her, what she's feeling for me. I can try to pretend, I can try to forget, but it's driving me mad, going out of mind. All the things you said, all the things you said, running through my head, running through my head, running through my head. All the things you said.